Welcome! You're standing inside the Library of Alexandria, 3rd century before Christ, and you need a moment to understand what you're looking at. The room you're in is larger than any room you've ever been in. The ceiling rises so high above you that the lamplight doesn't reach it. The upper darkness is complete, absolute, like a night sky without stars. The walls on every side are lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, and on those shelves, packed so tightly they touch, are scrolls. Thousands of them! Tens of thousands! More than you could read in 100 lifetimes. The smell is specific and overwhelming. Papyrus, dry, slightly sweet, with an undertone of something older, like the smell of river mud baked in sun, lamp oil burning in clay lamps that line the reading tables, and underneath everything, the smell of dust, the particular dust of old knowledge, of texts copied and recopied across centuries, travelling from Babylon and Athens and Carthage and Judea to end up here, on these shelves, in this building, in this impossible city on the edge of the Egyptian desert. A scholar passes you without looking up. He's muttering to himself, holding a scroll with both hands, moving his lips. He's been here since before dawn. He'll be here after dark. His sandals are worn through at the heel and he hasn't noticed. He's reading a medical treatise from Egypt that's older than Moses, and he cannot stop. This is the greatest library the world has ever built, and someone is going to destroy it. The greatest library the world had ever built, and within a few centuries, it was gone. Tonight we're going to investigate the crime. Not just who burned it, though we're going to go through every suspect, every theory, every piece of evidence. But the deeper question, the one historians argue about and almost never ask clearly enough. If this library had survived, if those scrolls had made it to the Renaissance, to the scientific revolution, to us, would the world actually be different? Would we have cured cancer centuries earlier? Would we have reached the moon in the year 1200? The answer is more complicated than you think, and more disturbing. Before we get to the crime, you need to understand what was actually lost, because most people, when they imagine the Library of Alexandria, imagine a very large room full of books. That's not what this was. Walk with me. Through the columned entrance hall, past the scholars arguing in clusters, an astronomer and a mathematician gesturing at a diagram scratched in wax, their voices rising. Through the reading rooms where men work in near silence, heads bent over texts, copying with reed pens in careful hands. Out into the garden courtyard, where a poet is reciting lines of Homer to a small group who listen with their eyes closed. This complex, the Mouseion, the Temple to the Muses, is not just a library. It's a funded research institution. The Ptolemaic kings pay scholars to live here, not to teach, not to advise the king, not to produce anything practical, simply to think, to read, to discover, to argue. In the history of human civilization, this has happened perhaps 3 or 4 times, that a government has said, here is money, here is shelter, here is every text we can find. Now go learn something. The results were not subtle. Eratosthenes, working here, calculated the circumference of the Earth using shadow angles on the summer solstice. His answer was off by less than 2%. 2%, without a single instrument we would recognise as scientific. Aristarchus of Samos, working here, proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun. 17 centuries before Copernicus. He was right. His argument was read, considered, and set aside, because the consensus disagreed. The scroll exists. The idea was here. Herophilos, working here, determined through human dissection that the brain, not the heart, was the centre of thought and sensation. He mapped the nervous system. He was doing neuroscience in 300 BCE. These are the foundations of modern astronomy, modern medicine, modern mathematics, developed here. Funded by a Greek king who understood that knowledge was the only power that compounded over time. Now, the scrolls themselves. The library held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its peak. Ships arriving in the harbour were required by law to surrender any books they carried. Scribes made copies. Sometimes the original went back to the ship, sometimes it didn't. The library held the only complete collection of Greek tragedy and comedy in existence. We have 7 plays by Aeschylus today. He wrote 90. The other 83 were here. It held Babylonian astronomical records so precise that modern astronomers have used them to recalibrate ancient star charts, Egyptian medical texts 3,000 years old, describing surgical procedures not rediscovered until the 19th century. The complete works of Democritus on atomic theory, more than 70 books. We have fragments of a few. Here is the number that should stop you cold. Of the roughly 700,000 scrolls held by the Library of Alexandria at its height, we have recovered the contents of fewer than 1%. Less than 1%. The other 99% is gone. Not damaged, not partially preserved. Gone. Now. The crime. Who destroyed it? Here's the first thing you need to understand. Almost certainly no single person did. The story most people know, Caesar burns the library, or Christians burn the library, or Muslims burn the library, is a story. A clean narrative imposed on something that was never clean. The truth is that the Library of Alexandria died the way most great things die, slowly, in pieces, over centuries. But there were moments, there were specific acts, and there are suspects. Suspect 1, Julius Caesar. 48 BCE, Caesar is in Alexandria, caught in a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Outnumbered and trapped in the harbour, he orders the enemy fleet set on fire. The fire spreads. Ancient sources, including Livy and Plutarch, describe books burning on the docks. Between 40,000 and 70,000 scrolls destroyed. But here's what those same sources also tell us. What burned was almost certainly not the main library. It was a warehouse on the docks. Scrolls waiting to be shipped or catalogued. The Mouseion itself, deeper in the royal quarter, appears to have survived. Caesar's fire was a catastrophe. It was not the end. Verdict: guilty of significant destruction, not guilty of the final crime. With suspect 2, the Christians, 391 CE. The emperor. Theodosius orders the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. In Alexandria, a Christian mob led by the bishop Theophilus attacks the Serapeum, the temple complex that housed the daughter library of the original institution. The Serapeum is destroyed, its library is burned. The head of the Neoplatonist school is a woman named Hypatia, mathematician, astronomer, one of the last great scholars of the ancient tradition. In 415 CE, a Christian mob drags her from her chariot, murders her, and burns her remains. With her death, the last functioning intellectual institution connected to the original library closes. Verdict: guilty of destroying the daughter library and ending the scholarly tradition. The original building may have already been gone. Suspect 3, the Muslim conquest, 642 CE. The story goes like this. When the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquers Alexandria, he writes to the Caliph Omar asking what to do with the library. Omar replies, and this quote has been repeated for centuries, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are heretical. Burn them." The books allegedly fuel the city's bathhouses for 6 months. Here's the problem. This story appears nowhere in the historical record until 500 years after it supposedly happened. The earliest source is a 12th century writer. No contemporary account mentions it. Arab scholars of the 7th century were famously voracious collectors of Greek knowledge. It was Arab translators who preserved Aristotle, Euclid and Galen through the European Dark Ages. The story of Omar burning the library is almost certainly a fabrication. A medieval slander. Verdict: almost certainly not guilty. The library was almost certainly already gone. So who did it? The Library of Alexandria was destroyed by time, politics, and the one force more destructive than fire: indifference. When Rome took Egypt, the library lost its patron. Funding became irregular. The scholar community shrank. The copying program slowed. The building, without maintenance, began to deteriorate. Fire didn't kill the library. The library was killed the moment the people in power decided that funding it was no longer worth the cost. That's the crime, not Caesar's accident, not Theophilus's mob, not Omar's alleged order. The crime was abandonment, committed slowly by dozens of rulers across 3 centuries, or each with other priorities. Each of them made a reasonable decision. Collectively, they destroyed the greatest repository of human knowledge that had ever existed. Now, the question the title promises: did it cost us 1,000 years? The optimistic argument goes like this. Knowledge doesn't disappear when a single building burns. Important texts were copied dozens of times and existed in multiple locations. There's truth in this. Euclid's Elements survived. Archimedes survived. The texts that formed the foundation of Renaissance science mostly survived, in Arab translations, in monastery copies, in fragments. But here's what didn't survive. The medical texts describing surgical techniques not rediscovered until the 1800s. Gone. The complete works of Democritus on atomic theory. Gone. The astronomical records of Aristarchus, who had the heliocentric model right. Gone. The 83 plays of Aeschylus. Gone. And here is the question that haunts every historian who works in this period. What was in the scrolls we don't even know existed? We know about Aristarchus because someone mentioned him. We know about Democritus because someone quoted him. But the scrolls we have no record of. Discoveries made and written down and never copied before the building decayed. Those we can't even name. We don't know what we don't know. Would we have reached the scientific revolution 1,000 years earlier? Probably not. Knowledge requires social conditions the Roman Empire never had. But 50 years earlier? 100? A specific cure found a century before it was found? Almost certainly yes. The library didn't cost us 1,000 years in a straight line. It cost us something harder to measure. Possibility. The paths not taken. The questions not asked because the person who would have asked them never read the scroll that would have sparked the question. That's what was lost. Not a building, not even the scrolls, the conversations that never happened. You're standing in the library again, 3rd century before Christ. The scholar is still muttering to himself, moving his lips over the ancient medical text, his worn sandals carrying him between the shelves. He doesn't know that the scroll in his hands may be the only copy that will ever exist of what it contains. He just knows it's worth reading. That's the thing about the Library of Alexandria that the crime obscures. It wasn't just a building or a collection or an institution, it was a belief. A belief that knowledge is worth pursuing for its own sake, that the act of understanding the world, even when it produces nothing practical, even when it costs more than it earns, is one of the things that makes human civilization worth the name. The crime wasn't just the burning. The crime was deciding that belief wasn't worth protecting. We still make that decision. Every time a research program is defunded, every time a library closes, every time we decide that the cost of maintaining knowledge is higher than the cost of losing it. The Library of Alexandria burned, or was abandoned, or crumbled, or all three, slowly, over centuries. It doesn't matter which, in the end. What matters is that no one stopped it. The lighthouse stood for 1,000 years before the earthquakes brought it down. It guided ships through the dark with fire and mathematics and human will. The library could have been that lighthouse, for the mind instead of the harbour. A fixed point of light every generation could navigate by. Instead, it's a warning. About what happens when the people who hold power decide that light is too expensive to maintain. The fire went out, and we're still counting what we lost.